Hello, my name is Matthew Finkel. I'm a high school student at Gerstel Academy, which is outside of Baltimore, Maryland. So many conservative politicians are adamantly against big tech and certain social media platforms, and they certainly have their reasons. But unfortunately, social media plays such a big role in the lives of young Americans. Myself, I see my peers often rely on social media for news updates on current events and political influence, which means they're usually getting a lot of leftist ideologies and leftist beliefs with little content coming from the conservative side. And as a conservative content creator yourself, do you believe that conservatives should be taking a greater initiative to connect with younger generations through social media, and how should they be doing that if you think they should?
Yeah, 100%. I think to back up a little bit, I actually talked about this subject at another YAF speech, I think in Illinois. The problem with big tech is a lot of politicians either don't know anything about technology or they look at it through a selfish lens. So like you'll see Lauren Boebert very angry that she was banned. It's one thing for people who have an already very huge platform to be banned and then fight it. The problem is that the vast majority of these people have probably been shadow banned or censored at some point and they have no voice. That's the real issue. And so I think it's very important for conservatives to fight to have a presence on big tech, not only because we need to reach people that we want to change their minds, but it is also somewhat of a free speech issue. The problem I have is a lot of people don't talk about this honestly. I think a lot of people like to look at big tech as just this demon boogeyman that we can blame for everything. In the same way the left blamed Facebook in 2016 for losing. I would much rather focus on the fact that big tech is a mirror of our culture, and that if we can fix the culture and respect things like freedom of speech, bring the Overton window back to something a little more sane, big tech's going to follow, because most of these companies only care about money. TikTok is a whole other thing. We should ban TikTok as a Chinese entity. Crazy that we allow it. But every other platform, American platforms, I think are salvageable. I think a lot of it comes from political pressure and cultural pressure, though.
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Alexi Smith, and I'm from Tulane University, New Orleans, Louisiana. My question is, obviously, transgender men in female sports or transgender men in female prisons is terrible. But do you think it is reasonable to make concessions of having trans-specific competitions and trans-specific prisons now to keep that safety, or would that end up just legitimizing the transgender issues more?
I think it's fine to create somewhat separated fields. I think certainly in prisons, because I think prisons are places where, as a society, we like just to lock the door, throw away the key, and not care. There's a huge amount, for example, of sexual violence in prisons that people on both sides of the aisle just do not care about. Our culture jokes about it constantly. Have fun in jail, or it's gonna get bad for you, don't drop the soap. Like, this is rape we're talking about, it's horrendous. And I think transgender people, more specifically biological men who have, say, transitioned to attempting to be female, they're at risk of really being under quite horrific, brutal circumstances if they're placed with already violent men. And so I think it doesn't embrace any form of transgender radical movement to acknowledge that risk and to try and do something about it. I don't think we should then place those people with women, because then that takes one risk and puts it upon another group who are already more vulnerable. And so I think separating prisons and having specialized groups would be important. I think there's going to be a lot of people abusing that, though. There's going to be a lot of men who are just pretending to be transgender to have an easier ride or to be put with women, for example, so we have to guard against that. I think in terms of sports, I think that's another complicated matter. I think we should have a separation, because it's absurd that men can compete with women. So whatever we can do to fix that, I think we should do within reason. If that means creating a separate competition, I think that's a good thing. Though, if we did that, I think a lot of people would no longer compete. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people who so-called transition to being a woman are doing so because they were mediocre in their sport originally, and then they're doing so because they want to win. They're driven by winning. They're not driven by some kind of deep social justice. Most people just go away and live their life otherwise. Like, living as a woman would be more important than living as a winning athlete. I don't think that's the case. So I think it depends on whether people are honest or not in their self-identity, but I think there are certainly things we can do in terms of separating people to keep people safer primarily.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Alyssa Tan from Baylor University, and I had a question for you regarding with feminists that claim to fight for women when they're actually just letting mentally and or predatory men in our spaces and kind of evading. And I know feminism is really hurting women, but they're actively doing this, and it feels like an attack on women. So I wanted to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think it's important as well to differentiate between forms of feminism. So I think originally the feminism I think we should all support is that women should have equal rights, women have equal value in the eyes of God and society and all those kind of things. That doesn't suggest that men and women are the same. And I think if you look at more modern feminism, it's the idea that men and women are the same and that women should be like men in a bad way. Like, let's be equal by making one side worse. Be more like men is how we achieve equality, which is just nonsense. Like, a lot of men are terrible people. You shouldn't be emulating that in 50% of the population. And so I think a lot of feminists on that side are kind of confused about what they're arguing in favor of. Because you cannot be a feminist which acknowledges the existence of male and female groups and also fight for transgenderism, which ignores that men and women are different and really immutable. And so I think it's just a fundamental flaw at the center of it. I think a lot of it is just a conglomeration of really radical thought where you're just jumping from view to view without really any undergirding philosophy or ideology. And so I think it's just confusion driving that. But I think if you speak to real feminists, that's why J.K. Rowling is making such a explosion of activity online, is because she's saying basic feminist things and getting destroyed for it. And so I think there are feminists out there who are still feminists. I think the feminists who are pro-transgender to the point where they are ignoring that women exist are no longer feminists.
Thank you.
All right, first, thank you very much for your speech, and good job for leaving Facebook. My name is Peter Key. I'm from University of Dallas. My question is, firstly, we had a speaker, a philosopher named J.W. Richards come to our campus last week, who speaks a lot about the issue of transgenderism. And he thinks it's quite likely that in the coming 5 years or a couple decades, that many of the individuals who have already gone through transgender surgery will start to have the side effects and the regret come to them, and they themselves will start to speak out publicly against transgenderism. Do you think that that's a possibility where the individuals who are currently supporting and going through transgender surgery will eventually be fighting against it, especially for those under adult ages?
Yeah, I think we're already starting to see it. Unfortunately, I can't remember people's names, otherwise I would list them. But there are certainly people who are speaking out against this. There are people who used to work in the medical field who are speaking out against it. And so I think those people exist. I think they're going to continue to come out because the fact is that a lot of these surgeries don't solve the problem because the problem is unsolvable. You cannot be made into a man if you're a woman or vice versa. It's physically impossible. And so I think a lot more of those people are going to start coming out. Whether or not they get a platform to speak is another thing. I'm also quite cynical about the way the left looks at most of these issues. I think they bounce from thing to thing. Honestly, I think it's as cynical as they almost like whatever the latest so-called freak show is, they focus on that as their key issue, and then they move on to the next thing. It's not about the actual people. It's not about the transgender people who are suffering. They just want an issue. And so they tie on to whatever they can find as the most radical issue of the moment, then they'll move on. Kind of in the same way some people are starting to talk about minor attractive persons for pedophiles. That's possibly the next step, but there are so many other things we could be talking about. I think society will likely, unless we do something now, embrace the idea of transgenderism. It'll become quite normal, and then the left will move on, and a lot of these people will be forgotten because they will no longer serve a social or political purpose. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we give them as much of a voice as they can, but that's why it's important for us to find those people now, because we're really at the tipping point. I think 10, 20 years' time, if people are growing up with the idea that men and women are the same and completely interchangeable, it doesn't really matter if people speak out. The societal change has been made. And so that's why it's so important to fight it now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dane Pongos, and I'm from the University of Illinois. So I would like to think that I'm kind of an outlier here. I'm not really a conservative, I'm more of a libertarian, and I identify as non-binary. So I know you've been, thank you, by the way, for being here. I love how you, at the start, you made that distinction between
Thank you.
the ideology and the person. I think that's really important, especially when talking about these kinds of issues. And I do agree with you on a lot of things. Like, I don't care, like, call me whatever you want. Like, I don't really care about pronouns. I don't want to transition. I don't want to do any of that kind of stuff. So what do you say to people kind of like me you know, who don't want to do all of these things. You know what I mean? But yeah, I still do think that this is, you know, like certain things like, you know, I think it would be more efficient, you know, to have like, you know, like segregating bathrooms based on like gender. That seems kind of inefficient to me. You know what I mean? So that kind of stuff. Like, what do you say about that? Also, one more thing. Like, the vast majority of like trans people are not. They don't rape. They aren't pedophiles. They don't do, like, the vast majority of children don't even want to transition. So yes, what do you want to say about this?
So I think on the last point, I wasn't suggesting certainly that the vast majority do. The fact is it does happen. And when we need to talk about risk versus reward, the idea that when we're already talking about a subset of vulnerable people or aggressive people, so for example, when we're talking about prisons, we're already talking about a subset of people who are more likely to be violent or more likely to rape. I'm not talking about the general transgender population. When we're talking about prisons, that's certainly far more likely. And so, would you mind repeating the earlier questions? Because there are like 3 or 4 questions in there. I want to address all of them.
I wrote down a lot of stuff just because this is important to me. But like,
Of course.
as someone who is transgender but doesn't like really like, you know, I wouldn't force you to call me anything. You know, I wouldn't force you to allow me into any sort of competition or anything like that. What would you say? Because I feel like that's the vast majority of trans people. You know what I
Well,
mean?
I would say I think that's great that you came today. I think it's great you asked the question. And I think we need more people exactly like you who are counterbalancing the narrative that the left push, which is that the radical position is the majority position. Because that's the impression people get, is when people, the majority in the middle say, are silent, and all you hear is the radical of both sides, that transgender people are evil, or transgender people want to trans every single child, rape people in prisons, all those kind of things, then you get to a point where it's almost a responsibility of the conservative movement or people who are just anti the radical movement to find people who are willing to speak on the sensible side, really the apolitical side. You can sort of talk as someone who is, say, identifies as non-binary and say what that means to you, and that doesn't necessarily mean you want the radical elements of the movement to be pushed. That's very helpful. That's not political. That's not even disagreeing with some of the things people here will think. I think that's a very important element because ultimately that's what I care about too. I care about really children not being pushed down this road. I care about children not being mutilated beyond repair. I don't particularly care if there are adults who think they're anything. It's not anything to do with me if a man thinks he's a woman or a woman thinks he's a man or a man thinks he's non-binary or any of these identities. It makes no difference to my life. The problem is when we move from forcing other people to engage in what is really an irrefutable position, in some ways a delusion when we get to the extreme levels of it. When you're forcing other people, that's the line for me. So just like someone's existence is not a problem. I think that's the issue, is when a lot of people get accused of being a bigot. You don't believe I exist. I believe you exist as a human being who believes something. I don't have to believe that, but I think you have a right to exist and have the same rights as other people. I do not think forcing other people to embrace your viewpoint is part of that right. I think that's the line. It seems like that's kind of where you're at too. And so I would just applaud you for speaking out here and doing so where you feel comfortable doing, because I think the more people who do that, the more progress we'll make in this general field.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ryan Schobeck. I'm from Northwestern University. Kind of on a different note, I really enjoyed your Twitter tirade regarding Joe Rogan's comments this last week. And my question is, what do you think is the best way to draw a line between cancel culture and holding people accountable for what they say?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question because cancel culture is over-defined and over-prescribed in that no one can do and say whatever they want and sort of get away with it. For example, I couldn't walk in naked to a workplace and expect to still be employed. I couldn't then say, oh, it's cancel culture, right? There's lines of acceptability for everything. I think that's a problem with the discussion around cancel culture, is that it's been diluted to the point cancel culture is just sometimes someone being fired for what we like or dislike, and sometimes it is being forced out. I think the key thing is just defining what our Overton window is. I think in terms of holding people accountable, I would say that I'm not calling for Joe Rogan to lose sponsorship. I'm not calling for people to stop listening to him. I'm not calling for Spotify to kick him off the platform. I'm not calling for any of this. The issue I have is when people oscillate between being a comedian and making jokes about Jews, which I have no problem with. I make Jewish jokes all the time. Like, some of them are funny, right? It's comedy is comedy. You can make jokes about everyone. That's the whole point of comedy. I have a problem when people oscillate between comedy and commentary, and they use both sides as an excuse. When I'm not funny, I'm a commentator. When I say something that's overtly not true, I'm just joking. He was having a political discussion with two commentators about Ilhan Omar, who's one of the most forward and open anti-Semites in the country, hugely influential on the left, and a driver of a very dangerous form of anti-Semitism in contemporary so-called anti-Israel anti-Semitism. It is not acceptable to be making Jewish jokes in that context. There was another video of him speaking to, I believe, another comedian in April and kind of making some jokes about Jews. They were talking about how they're disproportionately successful, which is true. And I think Joe Rogan made like a puppeteering joke about CNN. That's, you can like it or dislike it. That's not a problem to me because it was two comedians just talking about a topic and making fun of it because he was in a comedian space. You have to decide which side you're working on for me to then be able to say how I think you should be judged. So if I'm judging Joe Rogan as a commentator, I think his statements were, I don't really care about being offensive. I'm not offended by it. I'm concerned about tens of millions of people who listen, many of whom are vulnerable young men who are driven by what he says, taking that under their wing and then that having violent outcomes, which we are seeing all over America today. There is a reason Jews in New York City are being punched in the face randomly is because people think they're rich and greedy and they're responsible for their ills in life. And so when people say things that mirror that ideology, it's not acceptable to just go say, oh, he was joking, and just move on. But if it's comedians saying things, I don't care as much. I wish they perhaps made more ironic statements which fought anti-Semitism at the same time, but it's not for me to say what they should say as a comedian. So that's really where I draw the line. I hate cancel culture. I would rather people not be pushed from a platform. I would rather them stay and us have an actual discussion over why it mattered what they said. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of people defending Joe Rogan who just don't care or want to move on or want to maintain a relationship with Joe Rogan for their own financial gain, for example. That's a bigger problem for me than really defining cancel culture. I think this has nothing to do with cancel culture.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jaren. I'm from Michigan State University. Go Green. A lot of times
I didn't get any of that. That went straight over my head.
A lot of times when conservatives talk about transgenderism, they say things like, well, why can't boys just be more feminine, or it's okay for girls to be tomboys, which I don't necessarily disagree with. But my question is it possible to, or can a world exist where we argue both that, you can't change your gender, but also that men should not be wearing dresses and makeup?
I think it's two different questions. I think one is just a societal expectation of how you present yourself and what's normal and not normal to dress. There's been periods of history where if we wore what we wore 20 years ago, people would look at us as bizarre. I think it's kind of the same thing. The issue I have is far more sort of ideological and philosophical, of the idea that you can be a woman when you are not. I think those two things are a very different thing. Putting on a dress does not make you a woman, and I think that's what we're seeing from a lot of people on TikTok. Of like, I put on makeup, I'm living as a woman now. It's like, no, you're not. Like that is a line you can never cross. So if you want to be a man that wears dresses, people will think that's strange or not strange. Some people will care, some people won't. If you want to wear makeup every day or not, I don't really care, because that's not pushing an ideology on someone. That's just making a fashion choice. You're making an ideology choice when you're arguing that biology doesn't exist. And I think that's the line for me. Society will always celebrate some things and denigrate others. I don't think that's really for any of us to say is right or wrong. It's just natural. Certainly we shouldn't be bullying people for their choices, but you're allowed to think something is strange. But I think there's a key difference there between then biology, and that's why I tend to focus more on the ideology rather than just the wearing dresses stuff, because if a guy wants to wear a dress, I don't care. I really don't care. I care if he wants to put on a dress and then use that as an excuse to go into a women's restroom and get undressed and walk around. I think that's a problem. So that's where I draw the line.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, this next question will be our final one.
Howdy, my name is Stormy and I'm from the Texas A&M University. Woo! I have a friend who is a female and became male, and I'm worried about his mental health. I just see it deteriorating the more I talk to him. Is there a way to like, without being offensive, to
Mm-hmm.
like show him to the light and, you know, accept the way that God created him?
So I think one is empathy, I think, is very important. I think speaking to someone as a human being rather than jumping straight to the end point, which is, I think you're delusional. I think like this is a mental illness. I think you need to get help. I think first, empathizing with how someone feels about themselves is a very important thing. It's kind of what I did at the start of, I can acknowledge that someone truly believes they're a man or a woman. Like that doesn't betray how I feel as a conservative about the issue. I think you can believe someone believes something and it not be true. So I think being there as a sort of apolitical, somewhat non-judgmental friend and actually talk to them about what they're feeling can help a lot. And then just talking perhaps about not solutions, but steps that you can take that are less abrasive and less irreversible, rather. Because people often look at this and think, well, the only solution is to so-called transition. So that's the last step and not really a worthwhile step. And a lot of people who get therapy, especially if they're younger, have some success there. But I think a lot of people need to realize that there are others out there who are supportive of people as human beings, and so therefore can speak about this issue, and then maybe slowly meander them towards the idea of getting therapy that's non-surgical in nature, and perhaps talking to someone who isn't a radical leftist with a white coat. I think that's the difference here.